And that's the other thing, to recognize what we know and what we don't know. And you have to be honest with yourself. For example, I use this as an extreme example. I don't know that the world isn't flat. I'm just 99.999 to infinity convinced it isn't flat.
Right.
I've gotten in planes, I've flown, I see the edge, but I've never been high enough to see the curve. I've never been in outer space. I've seen pictures of outer space and from it, so I'm going to assume those are legitimate, but I don't know.
That's like Descartes with the I think, therefore I am. That was the whole thing. He said, how do I know what I know? And he kept
Yeah.
tracing it back. He said, the only thing I know for certain is that I'm thinking, so I exist in some way. Outside of that, it's all a matter of probabilities. But yeah.
Yeah, and that's a tricky place to be, because it's really unnerving to realize that. Because then you begin to question, if you're not careful, you will question everything and drive yourself to madness. Now, if you're smart, you're going to question everything about yourself
Hmm.
and drive yourself to awakening, to illumination.
All right, Mark. Thanks for taking the time to talk today, man. It's great to see you again.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. Excuse me. It's always great to be on your show.
I appreciate that. And so today we have an interesting one. And this is a topic that you and I have kind of chatted about, mainly you talking about it, me listening. But so, we're living in this time where we've got there's a lot of Christians out there who are saying this is the apocalypse or the end days. We've got the Hindus with the Kali Yuga. Even I remember not too long ago, somebody it became big again how Carl Jung was talking about how this was going to be the age of the Antichrist. So we have all of these various traditions. We have Christianity at a very interesting point in its history. And today we're going to kind of discuss where among other things, where the Western esoteric tradition falls in with all of these topics, and kind of maybe a different way to think about these topics in this time that we're living through, this time of so many secrets being exposed. Like I think a lot about Swedenborg. Swedenborg said that the Book of Revelations wasn't talking about the end of time. It was talking about the repeated ends of cycles. And so it's a period that we're going to live in where like secrets are exposed and old systems break down. And so saying this for the benefit of the viewers and the listeners, the kind of stuff that we're going to get into. And so where we want to start is you had talked about these discussions about the quote unquote post-Christian age, what that means, what other people mean by it, how you see it. And so let's just kind of start there.
Well, as you know, um, many people in esotericism, or different aspects of esotericism, are not particularly friendly towards Christianity, with good reasons from their experiences. And they look forward to, its eventual withering on the vine, if not outright demise. Okay. Now, when you look at the statistics in terms of the number of people who are identifying as churchgoers, identifying as religious, we have that famous category, spiritual but not religious. And we look at the number of people who are identifying as Christian, and remember, that's a big brush. Listeners need to realize that is a big brush. There's a lot of subcategories in there that need to be thought of. Same when we say esotericism, that's a big brush, despite the size of the audience. And it just occurred to me once. I said, if we're in the post-Christian age, then maybe we're in the Christian apocalypse. And why not? And when we say apocalypse, we mean revelation, to things are revealed. One of the issues being with people who read John's apocalypse is they tend to interpret it very concretely, very, very concretely. And not to say there isn't value in that. I think we need to get back to that. There probably is some value in that. But what happens is the book then is then looked at as having a singular meaning. And that's where I believe all the trouble starts from. When we look at most esoteric texts or symbolism, we have to just be open to the idea that there's a minimum of 3 or 4 meanings here. Minimum. And in some instances, even more. depending on what you're dealing with. So if we look at this as a historical event, a cyclic event, both of which are social events, by the way, and a personal event of inner awakening, that is an initiatic experience, then we might be able to get a better handle on that thing we call the apocalypse. And one of the reasons I've always said that the post-Christian era is a problem for esotericism is because if you look at the symbolism and the literature and what we do, all of it goes back to a Christian Europe. Even when it has Jewish Kabbalah involved, when it has alchemy involved, when it has classical symbolism involved, somehow the broader cultural framework is that of Christian Europe, with the most famous and probably most influential aspect being the Renaissance. Or as I said so pompously last night, the Renaissance, which means rebirth. So let's look at, for us, let's look at it in those terms. We can look at the season of the apocalypse, a period of time, and we take that straight from Fulcanelli. That's straight out of alchemy. We can look at Jean Dubuis' initiation of the nadir, or when humanity is initiated, or the solar wind forces people away from materialism. I think the operative word there is forces. It's not pleasant. Because people are creatures of habit, for the most part. And that's really, if you want a good definition of enlightenment, it's not to be controlled by your habits. That's a very functional definition. So we have this initiation of the nadir, we have the season of the apocalypse, we have the Kali Yuga, which is fairly complex, and many people would say, no, we're not in it. Others would say we're in a mini Kali Yuga. That's okay, it all fits. I'm not looking to be right. To say this is right and that's wrong. That's part of the problem. What I'm looking for is a mechanism within the systems we study to understand what is happening around us. And then, of course, we have astrology in the age of Aquarius, which is the age of Saturn, by the way. It's a Saturnian age. It's an age of restriction. And during this period right now, we're also going to be experiencing powerful Gemini influences and Neptunian influences, which is why you're seeing so many people, and I say this literally, why they're so insane, why they've lost their stability, why they've lost their sense of dignity, why they've lost their sense of self-respect and capacity to deal with life, because all of their energies have been projected outward. And now that outward world is changing dramatically and quickly, and they can't deal with it. Understandable, but that's what's happening, and you need to deal with it. We all do. There's no exceptions. So we have all of those things happening, and I thought that would just be a good place a good topic to talk about, because, again, what does this mean to us as initiatic, not so much the Institute, because we're not an initiatic entity, but what does this mean to a lot of those initiatic orders and societies? And I've talked about this even at Masonic events. Just in terms of, this is if we're in the post-Christian age, look at the numbers. What does that mean to our membership? How do we get people to join and participate in this because of the cultural dynamic?
And so we come back to initiation. You've said it a few times. Before we go any further, for the people who might have really no idea what that means or have a vague idea what it means, could you go in a little bit what you mean by that so that we have that covered before we go further?
Initiation is a word that describes an experience that moves us in a new direction. It initiates or starts something. And you have two versions of it that we're basically focusing on. One is the external aspect, which is ritual initiation in a fraternity or organization or group. And that can be very simple. It doesn't have to be, super duper scary, movie of the week kind of stuff. It can be, when you complete some kind of training operation, like in the military, and you get your jump wings, the way they're presented to you is a tradition.
Hmm.
That's kind
Interesting.
of an initiation. Everyone remembers it. You're different from there on out. You have this new skill. You belong to this new special group.
You
So we have
joined the egregore.
right, you join the egregore. So we have a lot of initiations. We're concerned mostly with those which are metaphysical or spiritual in nature, which are guiding us on the path of return. Return to what? To our basic nature. I like the term, and I'm stealing it from uh, one of the Buddhist groups, a basic sanity.
Hmm.
Our a functional basic sanity. So with that, we realize that we have many habits within ourselves, many ideas, many beliefs that we've carried around since time immemorial. These exist mostly below the threshold of consciousness. And you can address them through psychotherapy, particularly if you have a good therapist, and you can do that over several years. You can address it through initiation. Initiation can force them to the surface, but you still need to deal with them. So just bringing them up doesn't necessarily mean you're dealing with them. And then, of course, there's the inner initiation, which is the inner awakening, the inner realization of something new and powerful and meaningful in your path of return. Remember, and I'm focusing, that's a real, genuine initiation. You are forever changed by it.
Hmm.
And you'll know people who say, oh, I had this experience as a child or as a young adult or what have you, and I was forever changed. I spent the rest of my life trying to have it again. And it pushed them on the path. So those are what I would say is workable definitions of initiation. It's a kind of progressive interior experience.
Hmm. That's fascinating because talking to people who have no spiritual inclinations and certainly no esoteric inclinations, when I talk to them today, it's almost like they're initiated, but they don't know what that means, and so they're just confused and they're scared and they're seeing their old beliefs break away, and it's leading to that kind of insanity that you mentioned earlier. So, like, what does that mean for people who are being initiated, but they don't know what into? Like, they're just being dragged along. Like, how should they think about what we're living through, where so many things they used to believe they're realizing aren't true? They've lost their faith in their institutions, be they spiritual or political. They've even lost faith in themselves because they're starting to see things. By seeing the outside world, they're seeing things in themselves. So what do we say to these people that are so confused and scared?
Accept it and ultimately realize you are responsible for yourself. Then you're responsible for your family. Then you are responsible for community. And then you are responsible for your spiritual traditions and your gods. And your gods are your ideals. You are responsible for that, no one else. Now, of course, other people are going to have that view too, or hopefully, and that will make for strength. Strong people make strong groups. But you have to take full responsibility for yourself.
And that's something that people have increasingly become unaccustomed to doing. People have
Yeah,
been able to offload their self-responsibility for so long.
well, what we've done over the last 20 years in particular, 25 but 20 is there's been an active effort to make young men weak. It's to make everyone weak, but there's been a target on young men. And that weakness that people are experiencing is then where they feel out of control and they want things to change. They want things to stabilize. See, the movement is crazy making, constant movement. So I want things to stabilize, to be predictable. And then they're willing to accept pretty much whatever you get because the predictability is safe. I understand that. I get it. We all want that. We want a nice, somewhat safe and stable environment to live in, to undertake our activities. But your activities have to be fundamentally spiritually oriented. You're passing through this world. You have to be in the world, not of it. And when we see people experiencing this initiation of the nadir, this initiation away from materiality and ignorance, many in the New Age movement have talked about it in extremely glowing terms, as if, people are just going to suddenly wake up and be fully enlightened beings and there'd be heaven on earth. Now, these things take a process. These things take stages. So you have to think you've got, let's work with a number. What's the world population?
I think 7 billion now.
Yeah, I was going to say 8 billion, but let's say it's 7.5, because then we can get some round numbers. 1% of that is 750 million, right? Is that 1%? Or no, 75 million. 75 million, because 750 million would be 2/3 of a billion, and a billion is 1,000 million. Okay, so 75 million. Okay, that's 1%. We can probably take 1/10 of that, 7.5 million. And that's the number of people on the planet who are dedicated to this path of awakening. Now, it's a small number, but the influence and the impact can be larger depending on what they do and how they approach it. That's also where we talk about the power of egregores and all of that. But this is where, when you look at the rest of the folks, some of them are very generous, very kind, kind of very middle of the road. I know a lot of people like that. They're very reliable, trustworthy, but they're simply not deep thinkers. Now, that's the problem, because now when events like this occur, they really don't know what to make of it.
Right.
And it disturbs them, understandably. Then you have the fact that in the United States, half the population didn't read a book last year. You have probably upwards to 15, depending on how you want to cut it, 15 to 20% of the population is functionally illiterate or illiterate. Now, how are they going to respond to these changes? I mean, just look at the riots back during the COVID years. So we have to look at the events around us and say, how is it that we as individuals can look at this, work our way through it, and be as beneficial to those around us as much as possible, without looking for exterior support from, governments or big agencies, because it's probably not going to be there. It's probably not going to be there, because Saturn, the age of Aquarius, is the age of Saturn, and that's the age of restriction.
Right.
The age of limits. The age of make your bed, clean your dishes, and pay attention to what's going on. And it's not what we were told. It's not the age of Aquarius we were sold.
Right. A lot of angry hippies right now. No offense to the hippies, man. I love the hippies. There's a lot of angry hippies right now.
Oh, offend them. I don't care. I mean, I know, it's a great idea. There are a lot of angry hippies, which is telling. I mean, it was a great idea. I would love to have been a hippie like that. Come on, it would have been a hoot, a load of fun. But yeah, I'll be honest with you, it would have been great. But it didn't work.
Right.
And therein lies the problem. It would have been a lot of fun, but it didn't work, unfortunately. So that's it. That's kind of the situation we find ourselves in. So then with that, we have to make sense of what's happening and in the future we're going to build for ourselves.
And so what do you like, speaking about that future, there's the external things about building new systems and everything, but sticking with this idea of the initiation and maybe helping people think of it not so much as just a terrifying tearing away of the old, but as an introduction to something new. Like, how would you approach somebody, maybe who has never had these kind of, never really had a strong spiritual bent, and they're living right now in this chaotic time? How could they see things so they could feel a little hope in it, or at least some courage?
Well, that's it. You have to get a spiritual bent. Otherwise, cowardice is the norm. And when cowardice is the norm, so is selfishness. And when
Right.
selfishness and cowardice is the norm, so is greed, despair, and all sorts of terrible things.
Mhm.
And that's the point of the initiation of the native. That's the point of the apocalypse. It separates. Two would be there, but one will remain. I separate the
Pretty
wheat.
harsh. It's pretty harsh.
I separate the wheat from the chaff.
Hmm.
So if you don't have a view that says, hey, there's life after death, whether heaven or hell or purgatory or somewhere else, some astral plane, or don't have some notions of reincarnation, what that may mean, harsh changes in your physical life and the end of your physical life is going to be terrifying. And that's why we see so much. And this is kind of what got me thinking along these lines for this discussion. That's why we see so much emphasis now on transhumanism.
Right.
You know, this idea that you're going to upload consciousness into robots or computers or something and live forever, or even, and some of these people, by the way, that you can't write them all off.
Hmm.
They're smart people. It doesn't mean everything they have to say is going to be of value to you, but it's going to be important to you because they are big, they're influential, and they're rich. So they're going to be shaping ideas and movements. So you need to know what they believe, even if you don't agree with it, or even if it's just patently wrong. I saw a 14 or 17-minute presentation by, who was it? Brett Weinstein.
Mm.
And people said it was complex. I didn't think it was terribly complex. It was pretty straight up. But here's a really smart guy who identifies, he says, you know, he identifies as a um, liberal, atheistic, non-practicing Jew, which is important to understand all of those cultural significance there. And he's talking to us about the current trends in terms of going from information warfare, which is what we're experiencing, where we're constantly bombarded by ideas and information to control our minds. You know, it's advertising on steroids. And moving away from that to kinetic warfare. Kinetic is just a polite term for hot. And in today's environment, we have to recognize that, you know, nuclear weapons are a reality. We do not want to see them get used. We need to engage with people who are going to demilitarize, particularly on the nuclear level and on the biological level and the chemical level. We need to push that because, you know, as long as that remains, they're just a physical threat to everybody for generations. Even if never fired, just the fact that they exist and they
Right.
break down and they need to be contained and managed. And all of that money that could have been used for something worthwhile is then just used to control the trash. So he gave a presentation and he talked about the need to get off the rock, meaning planet Earth, and look to resettle elsewhere. Of course, there's only one place, as I understand it, that's possible. That's Mars, and that would require a tremendous amount of effort. That may or may not work. I think that this notion of traveling off the planet is kind of indicative of what happens when smart guys like him don't really have faith in anything other than their own intellect.
Mm.
But that does not mean what he says is wrong or false. It just means it's reflecting his particular biases. Just as someone who is a super duper fundie of whatever denomination, their view is reflecting their biases. So we have to be open. We have to have our own views that are legitimate and reasonable. We have to have our doctrines, our faith. We have to have our practices that help to reinforce an awakened openness in us, not just reinforce our ideas, but an openness where we expand and experience more and more. Remember, progressive interior experiences is a good way to think of initiation. But when you get to someone like this, what are we to say? Who gets left behind, on this rock while they travel off to the other? So what we're seeing is a crisis of materialism and atheism and materialistic atheism, not metaphysical atheism like in Buddhism, but a crisis of atheism and materialism and selfishness on that level. And of course, it exists on other different levels too, but this is a big one.
And going with the transhumanism, this is a good time to bring up the whole Ahriman thing, which I think it actually preceded the Dark Journalist, but Dark Journalist seems to have kind of exploded it. The Steinberg, Steiner, his the whole Ahriman, which I believe goes back to Zoroastrianism, and the way that it's formulated by the Dark Journalist and according to Steiner is Ahriman is basically like ultra intellectual technology, no soul, no like love, no warmth, and that this is kind of the era we're living through, this era of Ahriman. So, and I know you've become aware of this and you have some thoughts on it. So, could you discuss that a little bit?
Yeah, I was introduced to this decades ago. I didn't pay too much attention to it then. And I think it's true. I think that we're probably seeing that Ahrimanic influence, for lack of a better term. But remember, we're trying to take the words of Steiner, and he's trying to take ideas that are complex and make them digestible to people in 1920. And now we're trying to take his ideas and make them digestible to people in 2025. And if you want to think of it in very simple terms, it's in Kabbalistic terms, it would be the total clipothic forces of the pillar of severity. Excuse me, mostly Hod, but severity as a whole. If you want to think of it in non-Kabbalistic terms, it's the totality of the shadow, totality of it, because it overshadows spirituality. There's a flip side to it too. There's the Luciferian current, which is essentially the hippie current. The hippie current would be Luciferian. It's all about having a good time and good experiences, but it kind of has limits to it and can be very irrational and can be very unengaged in really broader awakening for society as a whole. That's one way to look at that. I'm just trying to give people ways to wrap their heads around this. And then for Steiner, the balancing force is Christ.
Which is like the middle path between the Ahriman and the Lucifer.
Right. Yeah, middle path. And that's what we call spiritual awakening, a realization of truth, a realization of reality as it is. And if you have some realization of reality as it is, then you can manage your social relationships, you can manage your joyful relationships, you can manage your technology and not be managed by it, not be overwhelmed by it. It's simply what happens when you go to extremes. It's the problem of going to extremes.
Yeah, and it is. I mean, it's difficult because we've talked about this before. I've been a lifelong reader my whole life. I love reading books. And even I, over the last couple of years, it's a battle against my phone, man. The phone, like it distracts me and it prevents me from doing like sustained reading. I'll read a few pages and then I want to check my phone to see what's going on there. It's very annoying, and to me, it's kind of like a microscopic picture of what's going on to everybody. Like your attention's constantly being pulled back to this force, this thing, this internet thing, this Ahrimanic technology thing.
That's a great point, because what it does is it robs you of your agency. And if you're to make progress on the path, And I'll say any path, any path. You want to be a rock star, you want to be a master mechanic, you want to be a lawyer, you want to be a master builder, you have to have dedication to your vision. And that dedication to your vision is essential. And it can be short term. We see short term dedication exemplified very well in the 12-step movement. Just for today. Just for today. And if today's too long, just for this 4 hours. If that's too long, just for this hour. And this plays a huge role, particularly in yoga practices. All practices, by the way. It just happens to be very well delineated there, in which you set a goal for yourself and you undertake what needs to complete that goal, and then you complete it. That's called willpower, dedication, choice. I have chosen, I have acted, I have reaped the fruits of my action. That dedication is extremely important, because when we undertake a path or a journey, many things will arise which will attempt to distract us from it, and we have to be able to not let them obstruct us, get in our way, overwhelm us, what have you.
And so speaking of Ahriman, you've also mentioned in the past the age of Ophiel and the Michaeleens.
Yeah, that's a strange one. It really is.
Yeah, I haven't really heard anything besides the little snippets you've shared, so I'd love to hear more about it.
Well, the easiest way to think of it is, well, the age of Aquarius is the age of Saturn, and the age of which comes after it in 2400 years, or so to speak, is the age of Capricorn, and that's the age of Saturn too.
Oh, interesting.
And that's going to be a piece of work. So when we look at this age that Steiner spoke about, which comes in, I don't know, what did he say, 1500 years or something like that, or what have you, whatever it was. It's a very, very severe time in which those people who have dedicated themselves to human enlightenment return to hopefully make that happen. It has certain similarities to the Kala Chakra Tantra and the Bodhisattva armies of Shambhala. It has some resemblance to that.
Mm-hmm.
I find it to be a bit peculiar. I do like Steiner to some degree, but I also find it oddly, at least maybe it's the way it's presented. Maybe it's the way that the followers now present it. Oddly obsessed with this notion. Maybe it's good, but I'd rather say let's focus on skill building. We're in a crap show. We all know that. We have a pretty good idea how this is going to go. Astrology tells us, predictions tell us, forecasting tells us. This isn't a surprise. I don't need to wrap it up in some kind of, great prophecy by my idea of what an enlightened leader might be like. I don't need that. I can trust my own observations.
Mm-hmm.
And the observations of people I know who are trustworthy. So instead of obsessing over this notion of some army of quasi-angelic light bearers in 1500 or 2000 years, we focus on, well, what would it take for you to be in that? Because it's not the same as, signing up and joining the Navy SEALs. Maybe it is. Maybe it is. Maybe when we look at what is required of someone to even be considered for SEAL training, just to be considered for it, maybe that would be like the metaphysical equivalent. So if you're going to go that, what's the metaphysical equivalent? Well, first of all, it's trust in yourself, clarity of thinking, stability of mind, profound generosity and goodwill. So develop these characteristics now. And maybe if you work on them, maybe those special forces, so to speak, will never be needed.
Hmm.
Maybe we'll create a social and worldly context where things are much better.
That's an inspiring call to action, living in this time where everybody feels like there's no they have no agency or about what's going on to frame it as though, well, this is actually an opportunity for you to, do you want to be one of these people? Or do you want to at least strive for it? Maybe you'll fail, but you can at least, even if you go to SEAL training and you fail, you tried it, right? You got to experience it. So I love that. I think that's very it's like inspiring. So how about John Dee? You've talked about this a little bit of John Dee's talk about this era, the apocalypse. How do you think he fits into this?
Oh, that's a weird one, isn't it? I say that in all seriousness. John Dee's original Enochian writings are strongly apocalyptic, understandable given the period of the day. And then you see some notions coming out around 2000. I'm going to just pick a date, roughly 2005, somewhere in there. And it was Donald Tyson's The Power of the Word. At first it was Tetragrammaton, then they renamed it The Power of the Word, which had to do with different combinations of Hebrew angelic names, mostly having to do with the banners of the 12 tribes. But there was a whole aspect in there of Enochian, how Enochian was meant to invoke the apocalypse, the revelation. I think there may be some truth to that. It's not a hill I'm going to die on, trust me. So if anybody wants to argue it, feel free. It's not I don't really, it's a talking point, not a doctrinal point.
Right.
Well, we have to say that because that's part of the indication of the age. We have some people who they're not capable of having polite discourse anymore. And
Mm.
you say something which offends them and they go off, which is part of the reason I suggest that we're in this transitory initiatic potential phase.
Mm.
And then we have, of course, Jason Wu's book on John Dee and the Empire of Angels and some of that stuff. I don't know, I may be wrong here, but I don't think he mentioned Tyson's book in his book. I don't think he did. And I always thought it fascinating because people love his book, Wu's book. And it is nice. And Inner Traditions did a good job. Yet 20 years ago, the same ideas were brought up in a different format, in a different way by Tyson, and he gets lambasted by the occult community.
That's interesting.
It's not unlike this whole talk about, and it's nonsense, but Trump is going to invade Canada. It's not going to happen, kids. And it's not because just ask the questions. Well, how's it going to happen? When's it going to happen? Where's it going to happen? Who's going to do it? When you start asking questions, these stupid ideas, and they are stupid because they're dangerous to us, begin to fall apart because they don't hold up to scrutiny. It's one thing when you're talking about something that just involves a handful of people. It's different when you're talking about something that involves what would be millions of people.
Right.
And many of them in leadership positions who would all have to sign off on this. Like, really, 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 you think that, yeah. And then how does this end? So when you look at these kinds of questions, with this apocalypse, the question is, oh, well, I bring that up because now when he said it, there's something to that we're told he said it. That's the other thing. We're told he said it. We don't know exactly what was said. And that's the other thing, to recognize what we know and what we don't know. And you have to be honest with yourself. For example, I use this as an extreme example. I don't know that the world isn't flat. I'm just 99.999 to infinity convinced it isn't flat.
Right.
I've gotten in planes, I've flown, I see the edge, but I've never been high enough to see the curve. I've never been in outer space. I've seen pictures of outer space and from it, so I'm going to assume those are legitimate, but I don't know.
But that's like Descartes with the I think, therefore I am. That was the whole thing. He said, how do I know what I know? And he kept
Yeah.
tracing it back. He said, the only thing I know for certain is that I'm thinking, so I exist in some way. Outside of that, it's all a matter of probabilities. But yeah.
Yeah, and that's a tricky place to be because it's really unnerving to realize that. Because then you begin to question, if you're not careful, you will question everything and drive yourself to madness. Now, if you're smart, you're going to question everything about yourself
Hmm.
and drive yourself to awakening, to illumination.
Oh wow, that's awesome. That's the preview right there. That's a great sound bite. That's profound, really.
Yeah, it's the difference between which direction we take our energies. So back in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, there was a lot of talk of North American unification. They're even floating around something known as the Amero, which would have been the,
Oh, I remember that. I was a kid, but I remember that.
yeah. Now, the New Age movement as a whole took that as gospel truth. One world government, North American unification, one world religion within the New Age movement from roughly the 1920s to the current generally took that as gospel truth. And it's understandable given the experiences of World War I and II and the Cold War. But it's interesting now how it's all these years later, and if something similar is said or is said to have been said by someone that is unfavorable, suddenly, it's a terrible thing. And that's just the reaction to external manipulation.
Hmm.
So you have to really separate out from these things. You have to really learn how to separate out in a healthy way. Decide what's important to you.
And on that same, I'm sorry, were you not done?
No, I'm good.
Okay, and that same frame of mind, something I observe a lot. I was a kid, I've been like a conspiracy head since I was a kid, so it's no big deal to me. But a lot of people now are looking, they're like, wait a minute. The things that I thought were in control of the world are not in control of the world. And they're just like starting to realize that there's all these machinations and players going on behind the scenes. And it's creating absolute paranoia because these are not people that are built by their temperament, nor have they had the experience to kind of ease into this. For guys like me, it's like old hat. But for them, it's terrifying. It's like truly terrifying. And how do they find some stability? Like, what do you say to them when it's because it is true that there are forces that are controlling things that we don't see. How do people hold on to some faith and some optimism in those circumstances?
There's two ways really to do the path, and there always have been, and it probably always will be. And one is you have to have complete and utter renunciation. And very few people are built for that.
Hmm.
And that renunciation is you're unconcerned with the world. You live in it, you work in it, you're part of it, you do your duty in it, but this is not, you're just passing through.
It's taking that biblical maxim to the its full limits, like
Yeah,
truly living in the world, not of it.
that's correct. And the other one is another version of that is to you take every experience you have as a message of your inner self or God or the cosmos to you. You ascertain what that message is, and you are now using everything at your disposal for your path. But your path better be one of awakening, not just one of trying to extend your good time.
Hmm.
And it doesn't mean you can't have a good time doing it, but that's not why you're here exclusively. Now, if you look at the notion of time, the apocalypse from the Christian viewpoint is a historical linear event. If we look at the Indian or other philosophical views, they look at time as cyclic. So the world is seen as the playground of the gods. Doesn't matter what happens here. This is just a playground. Doesn't matter what happens.
Hmm.
And that's a very difficult concept for people because how do they maintain the proper attitude or the proper view in the midst of profoundly disturbing experiences? You know, some people really love excitement. They love it. And some people really love war. They're known as war junkies, war addicts. And you saw the study of them started in the 60s, maybe the 50s, but really the 60s. And it had to do with kind of obsession with why are all these guys being mercenaries, particularly Africa. Africa was a huge place for mercenary involvement. And a lot of these guys, they just really liked what they did. And if you would ask them, some of them it was a bizarre cruelness. But if you asked others, it was not unlike what you would get from your average veteran, as many have said to me. Everything I had to do was clear.
Right.
I was a man among men. There was no ambiguity about anything. Now, that's a great way to live. So how can we do that where the battle is not outside, but within ourselves? And if we win the battle within ourselves, then the battle outside, if there is one, becomes much easier.
Mm.
And we see that discussed in the Bhagavad Gita with Arjuna's discussions with Krishna.
Mm.
I think part of the problem, too, is in the West, we have not had a good philosophical or religious capacity to understand or address the fundamental predatory nature of nature. There's a predatory aspect that we don't deal with well. We avoid it. We try to avoid it.
Mm.
You had sent me a video and it was really funny. Excuse me. It was this fellow who spent his time in Canada in the outback, far, 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 far outback. And he's reading letters from other people who do the same thing for their professional life.
That's Steve from How to Hunt. I just want to give it a shout out. It's a great channel, everybody out there. Steve, How to Hunt. It's a great YouTube channel. But sorry, Mark, go ahead.
No, put a link in it for them. Put a link.
I will.
And he had similar discussions as to who is that fellow we mentioned, 411.
Oh, David Paulides.
David Paulides. I think this other fellow, the one you sent me, was a little less sensational.
Mm.
Yeah, they had a lot of the same comments, a lot of the same ideas for the listeners who are paying attention. And this guy was talking. He was reading a letter from someone who's out in the outback there. They talk about the stuff that happens that people wouldn't believe. And when you're out there, and particularly like my friends who've been in South America, Central and South America, they just, everything wants to kill you in the jungle.
Right.
It just does. It wants to kill you. And we're not good with that. We don't handle that well. We want to think of nature as being all wonderful and beautiful and friendly and bunny rabbits and foxes and the little baby deer that come to my house. That's what I want it to be.
The
I don't
bunnies
want,
are just food for the bigger ones.
that's it. I don't want to think that there's a Sasquatch out there or a Wendigo. But if there is, I'm ready. Which is another interesting point I just want to bring up. Jean Dubuis made a joke, and it was a half-serious joke decades ago that, ceremonial magicians seem to be rarely seeing UFOs or extraterrestrials. So if you see one, just do a banishing ritual, send them on their way.
Oh, that's interesting. I never would have guessed he would have addressed that.
Oh, I think he knew Jacques Vallée very well. They were part
Oh,
of
wow,
this.
really?
I think they were in the same circles. They were running in
They were
similar
both
circles.
French.
Right.
That's right.
Yeah.
I never made that connection.
Yeah. So, yeah. So, and then of course you have that wonderful fellow who did a documentary maybe 1, 2, 3 years ago, 4 years ago. I remember listening to it in my car as I was waiting to pick up my son from a night class, and it was on Skinwalker Ranch.
Oh yes, yeah, I've read that book.
Now, of interest to you is that UFOs and Bigfoot sightings tend to go hand in hand. And in the early 70s, one of the largest areas of sighting was in western Pennsylvania in the Pittsburgh area.
Hmm.
Yeah. And there's some good documentaries and books on that, by the way. Now, I don't get obsessed with this. If they come my way, I'll take a look at it. But the funny part is I'm listening to this documentary and the guy goes, well, me and the boy, we saw something out there, a silhouette against the sky. I guess it was like a full moon or something. He goes, so went inside, got the 30-06 and some tracer rounds.
Don't know what it is, just shoot at it.
He goes, I saw the fluff as the bullet went through it and it didn't move. Fired another tracer just to see if I hit. We're like, yeah, that's right. Don't know what it is. Shoot. And where do you have tracers? Like, where? Of course he does.
Right.
You know, of course he's got tracers. Who doesn't, right? Better, he's a boy, be prepared. Be prepared. So, you think about that, if these things are real, and there's a wonderful series of videos by Navajo police officers, and they're more than police. Please understand this. These are not like borough or state police officers. They are exceptionally highly trained men in various search and rescue and survival methodologies and first aids. They're very, very highly trained. I would say they're kind of more of a paramilitary force
Hmm.
because
That
of
was
the
my impression too. When I listened to them, their stories were fascinating, but I was also just impressed. Like he took his job very, very well. The two guys, they took their job very seriously, and they were like elite.
they were elite. Yeah,
Mm,
and that's it. If you don't know what to do, you want to find men and women like this. You want to find people like this and aspire to be like them. You want to create role models in your mind of men and women who have dealt with similar situations, who deal with uncertainty, who deal with chaos, and have come through.
mm,
That's going to require that you read books. You may have to read a variety of books on different topics. You may find that they don't always suit your political uh, tastes because of the way things have gone for the last 20 years, but you're going to have to read them anyhow and say, how does someone deal with this situation? How does someone deal with these great problems in life? And then when those Navajo guys, when they talk about what they've seen and experienced, I have no doubt in my mind,
right,
none whatsoever, that this is legitimate. So but they have a cultural framework that allows them to manage that.
right,
And that's what circles back. So one of the things you have to look at is, what is the culture I am building for myself, my family, and my friends? What is the culture? What is the world I want to live in? I want my children and grandchildren to live in. And how am I building that,
mm.
creating that?
Like that's where that whole you talk about charitability a lot, and I think about that a lot as I'm trying to improve my ability to tie my social networks together, like in a not in a commanding or like control freak way, but like in a supportive way. And one of them is sending gifts to people, just like establishing that kind of energy of charitability and connecting people and bringing people together.
Yeah, and we do that with one of the things we have at the Institute is prison outreach program, where if incarcerated individuals write to us, we send them a couple monographs and a lecture in a practice book, copy of the Liturgy of Hermes. Practice. You see, one of the things too is it's easy to get caught up in ideas. We have to make sure that we're always wrapping things back into our practice. We have to wrap it all back into our practice. And that's really very important. Otherwise, it just becomes more ideas, and we can make ourselves we overeat on the buffet of ideas, and then we binge and purge.
Right. And that's, I mean, like, as you know, recently I've had some personal issues that I won't go into here. The response from the Institute, the people, the friends that I've met through the Institute for Hermetic Studies, which is what we're referring to when we say the Institute right now, it was amazing. Like that, I love the ideas, I love the studies, I love the meditations, but seeing that kind of camaraderie and that kind of support, it meant a lot to me. It really meant a lot to me, especially in this age. You just don't get that. I mean, I have people who are, I consider them good friends, but they just don't think to support the people. You know, it's like everybody's so in their own world. And yeah, that was like an emotional connector for me to the other members of the institute. Just showed their mettle and just they're good freaking people. Like good people. There's so many
Yeah.
good people in the organization, you know?
Well, and there's two things that were happening there. One is we stress action. This is Asya, the world of action. Karma is action. You know, what are your actions? Your actions tell me everything. The other part is that you got that support because you didn't come asking for it, but you put yourself in a position first to meet people, to help out, to do things. You made those relationships and contacts happen of your own free will, your own
Mhm.
volition. And if you join an organization, a church, a club of any kind, one of the problems that we see is many of those organizations uh, don't have well developed, I hate this phrase, but I'll use it, onboarding of new members. Onboarding is how you integrate someone into a system. So they lose a lot of members because no one walks up to the new person and talks to them or kind of introduces them and makes them part of it. At the same time, the new member has an obligation to put themselves out there. And if they're asked to do something, they need to do it. Whether it's just clean the table or help with the bake sale or whatever it happens to be. Because we move through life from one level of responsibility to another based upon our efforts. And in the spiritual dimension, if we do not make ourselves useful, then we have no right to ask for help from anyone or anything.
Mhm.
And that's very difficult for many people to grasp. Now, if you don't care, if you're able to just deal with life as it is and not care, that's fine. But if you are looking for changes or help or assistance in certain areas when things go really crappy, then you are essentially drawing upon your karmic bank account, if you will.
Hmm.
You know, the time to go to the bank is not when you need the money. You have to put it in ahead of time.
Right.
And if you're not doing something to accumulate, we'll call that, again, not a phrase I like, we'll say positive or good karma, energy on your end through assistance to others. Now, is that ideal? No, it's not. The ideal is to do everything effortlessly and without expectation and as a dedication to your ideal. And then you're completely karmic free, so we're told. Okay, that's fine. But if not, get out there and do some things that generate some good karma for you so that you find your situation is better in the future. And it doesn't work, you know, part of it is magical, meaning we don't really know how the system works, how these drawdowns take place. But a lot of it is pretty straightforward. You know, how are you treating the people around you? Are you taking care of the things you can take care of? Are you going out of your way to be helpful once in a while? Or maybe on a regular scheduled basis, like once a week or once a month? You know, it's an effort. The amount of effort you put in really matters. And we see that story of the old woman who gave 2 pennies to the temple. And Jesus says that that was tremendous because that's all she had. Did the temple need it? No, but that was her offering, her gift.
Hmm.
Yeah. And that was her way of being appreciative of what the temple offered her.
Hmm. So, also, another thing that you brought up, and we've passed the hour mark. We have a couple more questions I would like to ask, though. So, the Rene Guénon's Reign of Quantity and the Sign of the Times from 1945.
Yeah, it's just interesting because we see that since then there's just been this obsession with quantity more and more rather than quality. And, there's a Russian saying that says, I'm not so rich I can afford to buy cheap. And we just become obsessed with having more and more rather than what's the value? What's the value in this book? Someone says to me what their spectacular library they have. And I look at it and it's a lot of books in number, but it's not very good in quantity or quality. And they're often paperbacks who've already started to yellow and they're just going to fall apart in 20 or 30 years.
Hmm.
You compare that to, say, high quality hardcovers or older books. I just use that as an example, but you can look at anything that way. The clothes you wear to the food you eat, kind of obsession with, and that obsession with quantity is seen as a sign of degradation.
Hmm. And so, would you call this the season of initiation? There's a lot of talk right now, people seeing things that are going on, that the whole world, there was the talk of the Great Awakening and all that. How do you see this? Is this the season for the initiation, if for those who are willing to see it that way?
Yeah, and when the season of the apocalypse, Fulcanelli, uh, season of initiation means potential awakening, but it won't be pleasant because it can't be. Because at the level we're talking for most people, they're so obsessed with materiality that to peek behind the curtain is terribly painful for them. Many of them won't make it, they won't survive. And when you look at that initiatic process, you have to think of it as like, we look at it as a U shape. And on this descent at near to the bottom, there's intense materiality, intense. Well, then you reach the bottom and you start back up again. Well, if you're here on the ascent and you're here on the descent, you're really at the same level. That's why we see this obsession with ghost hunting and paranormal
Hmm.
phenomena, because that kind of materiality is the only way most people can begin to wrap their head around the notions of the invisible.
Hmm.
And then, of course, the ascent, we'll call it ascent continues. Another way to look at it is the widening or the opening up, a realization of more and more.
Hmm. And that's when people start seeking the spiritual again. They start abandoning the material world
End
as
all
a
be
source of
all.
happiness. What was
Yeah,
that?
and as an end all be all, yeah, as a source of
Right.
all happiness. Right. And the notion here too is that these people really aren't seeking the spiritual world. When most of the paranormal folks I talk to, they're really not
Hmm.
on the path. They're just like dancing around the doorway. But they take it real seriously. They think this is the end all be all. And no amount of talking to them can change that
Hmm.
because it's sensory driven, it's stimuli driven. And they require that external stimuli of that paranormal phenomena to convince them that the invisible world exists.
Hmm.
Whereas on the interior path, you're using meditation, ritual, alchemical processes, those types of things to awaken the interior experience and then experience it in the material. So
Hmm.
the path is reversed.
Hmm. Yeah, that's, even another thing that Steiner talked about that I don't see brought up as much, just tying it back to the whole Steiner thing, was he talked about these elemental spirits that they're trying to keep you trapped in Earth, like your obsession with them. In my interpretation is that it is these kind of like paranormal experiences. they can lead you to something higher. But if not, you just become obsessed with them and you
Hmm.
just begin running in the same circles your whole lives. Like I remember the one Bigfoot researcher, he was a older gentleman. Somebody asked him, they said, like, what would you say to young Bigfoot hunters? And he's like, don't do it. He's like, I wasted my life. You will obsess over trying if because he had a Bigfoot encounter when he was a kid and spend his whole life trying to have another Bigfoot encounter. And to me, it was just like emblematic of those people that get stuck with this obsession with UFOs and Sasquatch, and they're just running in circles their whole life.
Yeah, and it's completely irrational, which is the point. It's completely irrational. And even if they are decent people with good jobs, and I've met some, this irrational obsession destroys them. And Jacques Vallée talked about this, as did who was the fellow that wrote Mothman Prophecies?
Oh,
Keel,
John
John
Keel.
Keel. John Keel talked about this at length, how this obsession with it, it becomes destructive. It destroys you. It destroys your life.
Hmm.
And we can even say the same about esotericism to some degree. I've seen that to some degree. Um, but that's another story for another time. At least there's some mechanisms in there for pulling back from the edge. But there aren't many in this. There's like it's all or nothing. Either you're hunting Sasquatch or demons or Devil's Pit, or you're not.
Hmm.
Either you're doing it or you're not. And you go to your job, whatever that is, and you're thinking all the time of when your job's done so you can go do that other thing.
Hmm. You're not incorporating it, integrating it at all into your general approach to existence.
Right. And it isolates you from people who are not doing it.
Hmm.
And it isolates you from people who maybe they're not on a spiritual path, but they might be happier because you're not really on one either. You just kind of think you are. You're on a paranormal obsession. It's really no different than these guys at the CERN who are working on bridging the so-called material and invisible. That's just a form of what we call spiritual materialism.
Hmm. Interesting. So the last question, living in this time, this as we've been discussing, whatever it is, Kali Yuga, the apocalypse, whatever it is. And I'm not trying to rush. I'm just trying to respect your
Sure.
time. That's why I said last questions. Wherever this goes is fine with me. Um, so, what do you say when we're talking to people? I mean, we've been talking to people, but in as people, what's the healthiest way for them to think about this time, and what's the best way for them to use this time in a positive way so they can
It,
stop being scared and have some positive advancement?
well, that's it, the age of initiation. You're going to take advantage of these opportunities to initiate yourself into the deepest parts of yourself. You're going to develop and grow as a person. You're going to develop and grow on every level possible. So if that means stop eating junk food and exercising a little bit, doesn't have to be super, but just a little bit, that's what you're going to do. Because the strength that it takes to do that, you also can apply to other areas. You get good at one thing, and you can apply those qualities of determination and goal setting and skill building to other things. But have a path, have a meditation every day, and have positive thoughts about yourself and your capacity and positive thoughts about others. And we're not saying naive and foolish. We're saying the potentiality is here, and I will take advantage of that potentiality. The best for myself, the best for all, even if I don't know what that is. I want that which is best for everyone's awakening. And I open myself up to the service of the invisible masters, the invisible adepts, known and unknown to me, to work with them in making the world a better place and my life and those of everyone I know and don't know.
Hmm. And actually, I think I kind of fibbed. One more thing I want to say. So I just realized because the conference is coming up, and
Yes,
so
it
while
is.
we're talking to people about this opportunity to maybe direct your mentality in a more healthy way, the conferences have been great for me. I've gone to the last three. It's been great to meet everybody, and it's just been fantastic. And the upcoming theme I think is very intriguing and it's applicable to this. So could you just talk a little bit about the conference that's coming up in June?
Well, the conference is going to be extra long, meaning we're going to have a longer Sunday and more events on Saturday than we normally do. And we're going to have a lot of spectacular guests, and it's the theme is the Kali Yuga in Western esotericism. So we're going to be talking about this notion of the Kali Yuga, apocalypticism, both from a historical and practical point of view. And we just got a wonderful lineup of teachers and presenters and speakers. So it's just going to be a lot of fun. And they all have been a lot of fun. And we have some great sponsors too. Uh, Schiffer Publishing, Red Feather Press, the folks who did John Michael Greer's book, a recent one on astrology, and I know you interviewed John recently. Uh,
Hmm.
they are sponsoring our conference. So John was going to be there, but he double booked. So I said, okay, you can't be there. That's fine. Go to England instead. That'll be more fun.
All right. Well, yeah, and to everybody out there, the conference it really is a blast. Great people, all different kinds of traditions and ideas, and it's just a great time. I'll put the link in the description below this video or wherever, if it's on Spotify, wherever it is, I'll have a link so you can go to the conference or get a ticket to go to the conference. So Mark, thank you so much for all this, man. I appreciate this, and I think this was a great conversation. Is there anything else you would like to go over before we say goodbye?
No, just stay positive, have confidence in yourself, and act.